Following the death of King Henry VIII, the son he greatly wished for took over as the King of England, succeeding his brutal and tyrannical father. But the plan was for Edward VI to reign for a long time, and for his son's children to then continue the Tudor dynasty for centuries. But this never happened, as at the age of 15 inside of Greenwich Palace, the ill King of England succumbed to a terrible death, and he was for his last few months suffering. Edward VI was buried following his death inside of Westminster Abbey, but his resting place for a long time was lost. However, in the centuries after, his coffin was located and his coffin was even opened, and what those curious people found when they opened the casket was shocking. When Edward VI was just 9, his father, Henry VIII, died and was then crowned king inside of Westminster Abbey. A regency council was established to help him rule, and at the top of this was Edward Seymour, his uncle, the Lord Protector. However, in 1550, Edward VI was stricken with a mysterious illness which was very serious, and the royal doctors and physicians believed that this was possible, that Edward could have died, and because of this they were worried who would become king or queen next if Edward, the young boy, did die. However, Edward VI did recover from this, and this bout of ill health was kept a secret. But in the years following, the boy king did suffer another illness which was deadly. He would before this catch measles and also smallpox, but he did manage to recover again, showing that he was strong and was not always sickly and could demonstrate strength. But the king was at this time a little deaf and also wore glasses. However, in the December of 1552, things took a turn for the worse. Edward VI began to show signs of tuberculosis and measles, and the measles had caused the problems with his immune system. On the 15th of February 1553, it was said that the king was sick with a feverish cold, and Mary, his eldest sister, came to visit him. However, he was during this meeting bedridden, and he was displaying a very violent cough. Some rumours dominated the royal household that he had been poisoned, but to many, the king's health remained a secret. He had a number of different symptoms, which were all very serious, and the best doctors and physicians across England were brought in to treat him. One woman, who it's believed was almost like a faith healer, was let into the king's apartments, and she administered a potion that almost killed the king and caused his limbs to swell up. However, on the 17th of March 1553, things continued to take a turn for the worst. Edward VI, the son of King Henry VIII, was now a thin and weak young boy who was very gaunt, and the doctors recorded that he was approaching his death. In the April of 1553, his health did pick up slightly as he was spotted walking in a local park, and he was then sent to Greenwich Palace to recover. But it was here where he would die. Edward was seen in the gardens growing weaker, but he was coughing up blood, and some doctors still believed he would recover. But there was a belief that there was a tumour in his lungs causing his high fever, but his stomach was very swollen, and he also broke out in sores and ulcers. On the 17th of May 1553, he met with European ambassadors, and he was very weak during this, but his body continued to swell, as did his head and legs, and he was given tablets to help him sleep. However, then, adaptations were made to the line of succession, and the throne was then to be given to Edward's cousin, Lady Jane Grey. In mid-June, he was not eating, and doctors predicted that he had a matter of days left to live. The king's last few days were horrific, as he could only lay on his back and his hair was falling out. On the 1st of July, he was spotted by a crowd at a window, but on the 6th of July, 1553, Edward VI, at around 8 in the evening, died in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney. He said his final words, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." The doctors then, following his death, opened up his chest, and they found out that the king's lungs were infected, and he had 2 ulcers on them. Edward VI's body was embalmed and then sealed in a lead coffin for burial, and he was then to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, officiated the service, and the funeral procession was similar to King Henry VIII's. Edward's body was taken by barge to Whitehall, and the night before the funeral he was taken to Westminster Abbey, along with a large procession, and it was a huge event of pageantry. Many people cried and were upset when they saw the king's coffin, and once his body was taken into the abbey, it was surrounded by burning candles. The funeral service was performed, and Edward VI's body was lowered into a white marble vault in front of an altar which had been made by Pietro Torrigiano for his grandfather, Henry VII. There were plans considered for Edward VI's funeral, and there was a debate as to place Edward VI inside of a tomb, close to where his father Henry VIII had been buried in St George's Chapel in Windsor, but the tomb was never finished or worked on. Edward VI's burial vault itself was very small, measuring 2.3 metres long and 75 centimetres wide, and this was close to the entrance of a much larger vault of his grandparents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the Tudor dynasty. There were later talks, even later on, to bury Edward VI alongside his half-sister Mary I in the same tomb, but as mentioned, nothing would ever be made for the boy king. However, during the English Civil War of the 17th century, the altar marking where Edward VI was buried was destroyed by Puritans in 1643, and it's believed that the burial vault of Edward may have also at this time been disturbed or broken into. This was common at the time for many royal burials, as Puritans and other parliamentarians ransacked tombs and burials of those who were a symbol of the monarchy. But centuries later, in 1868, fragments of the altar were found, and a new one was then built marking where Edward VI was buried. However, the burial vault of Edward VI was then opened, and the Tudor king's coffin was found. It was said in 1868, when the royal vault was opened, that Edward VI's outer coffin, the wooden shell that had been partly cleared away, and it was damaged, meaning that someone had previously been in and had done this to the vault. It could have been the Puritans. However, there had been some damage to Edward's coffin and also some effort to even possibly break into his tomb. It was also said that the lead coffin of the boy Tudor king had deformed as well as wasted by long corrosion. Because of this, it meant that Edward VI's remains were on display and could be seen through the coffin, and there were no repairs done to give the Tudor king a new coffin. It was said the cerecloth had fallen away and showed that no hair was attached to the skull. This meant that Edward VI's remains had decayed and that his remains were now skeletal, and the cerecloth had not done its job to preserve the remains as best as they could, and this may have been caused by the damage to the coffin. Edward VI's coffin had been damaged by someone, or something such as internal gases building up and exploding inside of the coffin. However, the more probable possibility is that it was broken into and damaged when the Puritans attacked the altar next to his remains. But today there is no tomb for Edward VI, marking his small burial vault, except a small memorial stone that states, "In memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. This stone was placed here by the Christ's Hospital in thanksgiving for their founder, the 7th of October, 1966. Edward VI was the great hope for the Tudor dynasty, and he was the son that Henry VIII greatly wished for and wanted. However, his life was tinged with sadness and tragedy. As his teenage years, he died a very painful death, and his demise was horrific and brutal. But the mysterious damage to Edward's coffin inside of the burial vault was never repaired, and there were no efforts to sort this out, meaning that today Edward VI's skull may still be sitting inside of a damaged coffin. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.